So this is Nanfu Wang. She's the director of I Am Another You, which is the film we'll be talking about today, and that's her second feature. Her first feature was Hooligan Sparrow, which came out about a year and a half ago. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about what I Am Another You is?
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Nanfu, and I'm originally from China. I moved to the U.S. in 2011 and have been living here since. Yeah, as Rose said, this is my second film. It actually started off as something that is a birthday gift that I gave myself. So since I was in my 20s, every year I would, on my birthday, purchase a ticket, a train ticket, a flight ticket to a place that I hadn't been before, and I really planned. Usually what I did is I would go to the train station and ask for the cheapest ticket to a place that I hadn't been before. So the next day I would arrive at a new place and start the adventure myself. So on my first birthday in New York, I went to a bus station in Chinatown and asked for the cheapest ticket. And then they said, you can go to Florida, Orlando for $60. And I was like, sure, it's winter and I would be happy to go to a warm place. And so I went and I took a small suitcase, and because at the time I just learned how to film and I was obsessed with filming, so I would take my camera anywhere I go. So when I went to Florida and with my camera, started meeting people on the road, travelers, started filming them, talking to them, documenting my experience, until I met a guy who at first I thought was a traveler like myself in my age and very interesting. But later when I learned that he was intentionally living on the streets, I was fascinated by his choice. And I asked him if he would be willing to let me film his street life for 2 days, because I was very interested in the underground and the homeless life. And he said to me, well, you can't really understand the street life in 2 days. You have to live this life to be able to understand it. And I debated. Eventually, I made a decision. Okay, I'm shipping all my belongings back to New York. And I had a backpack, and I lived on the streets with him for a while. Little did I know that experience eventually extended and became this feature film. And are we showing the trailer now? Or? Yeah, we can watch the trailer now. I left China to find something I'd been searching for all my life. I bought a one-way ticket and went to Florida, where I met someone different from anyone I knew.
Every day is now. Every time is right now.
I really couldn't answer and say when I'll be done traveling in this way.
But anywhere I am, something likely amazing happens.
Dylan, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, man. Welcome to stay the night. Neat.
He seemed like a symbol for the free America I had always heard about. What made him choose to live on the streets?
I've been a detective since 2011. He looks just like I did when I was his age or younger.
I ran away from home one time and stayed here for a good couple of days.
He has the freedom to choose. He said, I'm out.
I just wish that he could see my side of the world a little bit better. I'm really just experiencing stuff that's in the ether that most people can't see.
First time he called me, said, guess where I'm at? At a mansion in Malibu. And he sends me a picture of the ocean. He's up on the hill in Malibu. Oh my gosh, this kid is living kind of a Forrest Gump, ultra-midi kind of existence. San Diego, Panama City, Florida, New York, and all kinds of places.
Wherever he goes, he leaves an echo to show. From the pitter-patter of his feet to the magic incantation he speaks. I am he is me, If you only knew he is another you.
Thank you. And next up we have Drew Xanthopoulos, who's the director of The Sensitives, and that's his first feature, although he has a significant career as a cinematographer in addition to that. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. How did I find this film? I had just finished grad school. So I'm originally from Montana, and went down to Texas for grad school and finished and was kind of looking for a first project. And I saw this photo essay in the New York Times called Canaries by Tilda Jensen, and it was images of people sort of on the run from basically modern life, chemicals and pesticides and electronics, wireless sort of things, and it was haunting. It was really haunting to me. So I eventually contacted the photographer and asked her a lot of questions, and for every question that was answered, I had 2 more questions, and so eventually she invited me to come out on a shoot. She was working on a book version of it, and I met through her people all around the country who had were basically hidden in plain sight and sort of completely on the run from their former lives because of these severe reactions they developed to common things. And for about 1.5 years, I was just trying to wrap my head around it, and then it took another 3.5 years to kind of understand that what I was really interested in was not this illness or the mystery of it, but more sort of how that affects relationships, how it affected people as spouses, as parents, as children. So yeah, for me it was this very, the personal part of the journey for me was, I think, kind of seeing how families and relationships were affected by something that just changed your identity so profoundly. So I ended up sort of shooting for about 3.5 years with people around the country with this condition, and yeah, and from that came The Sensitives. Did I answer everything? That was, yeah.
I think so. I think let's show the trailer.
It could be exhaust fumes, roadside herbicide treatments, pesticides. It affects the brain so much and imprisons us inside ourselves. That is the hardest part of this illness.
For some people, they just want to turn back the clock and see if they could get their life back to what it was before they got sick, and that's not possible.
Here, Meg.
Dad, say hi. Your turn. Close up. Extreme close up.
We've been married for over 30 years. We're life partners, unquestionably. I'm just not a very good one at the moment.
There ain't no alibi for leaving. Stay, try to think of some. Come on, there ain't no alibi for leaving. Stay, try to think of some.
And next up we have Jennifer Bria, who's the director of Unrest. And Unrest is your first ever film, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not
Great.
counting some wedding videos.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's my first feature, and I came to it when I became sick with an illness that is usually diagnosed as chronic fatigue syndrome, which is not the same as the illness that the sort of subjection Jews film have, but it's very closely related, I think. And so for me, it was really encountering a similarly hidden world that was in plain sight, but by falling through that rabbit hole myself. And it was a world that I didn't know existed. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I got a high fever, and then within about a year and a half became completely bedridden, and was told that essentially that it was all in my head when my labs came back normal. And I went online and found this sort of virtual community of people all around the world, many of whom had also been homebound or bedridden for decades, and started filming myself, and then began telling other people's stories sort of through my own exploration of the history and the science and the politics of this space.
Great. Let's show that trailer.
From as early as I can remember, I wanted to swallow the world whole. Anything was possible. I just thought I would have more time. I don't know what I did to myself. I don't think I can get up off the couch. I feel like my brain is misfiring. Sometimes I wouldn't be able to speak.
If you say too little, they can't help you. And if you say too much, they think you're a mental patient.
The doctor would tell me, you're just dehydrated. Everyone gets stressed. Then I went online and found thousands of other people just like me.
Yeah, I'm completely bedridden.
It's like I'm just watching my life disappear.
I have ME, CFS, that's chronic fatigue syndrome.
Historically, you can see illnesses very similar to this called many different things.
Saw someone collected the other day for ME. That's the one where don't feel like going to work today.
It's gonna pass.
Chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, I'm tired too.
When medicine has no answers for you, where do you turn? Oh my God.
It's like the craziest high school science experiment you've ever done.
Just because it's crazy doesn't mean it's wrong.
You're looking at the summer. I started filming more and more people all over the world from my bed.
Hi, Jen.
Hi.
You know what it is about being observed? Is that people feel sorry for me.
Baby, I'm so sorry.
I have the strength of a mountain.
We're kind of both organizing a day of protest as well as organizing individual protests.
All of those things, those really simple things. There's the sun. That life was gone, but here I have this new one.
And I'll take all you throw at me.
And I have to fight for it.
Well, I think what's like one of the things that you just said, Jennifer, was about falling through a rabbit hole into sort of a world that you didn't know existed, and I think that that's sort of what all of these three films are taking us into. And Drew and I were talking about this idea of like whose perspective we get in each of your films, and you three are each so much a part of your films, whether or not you're in your films. Like Nanfu, the subject is sort of told through your perspective, and Jennifer, you're like inextricably linked from it. And then Drew, in your film, you're sort of more of a, you're in almost, your camera is in the same seat as the audience. You're like, your presence is the sort of same presence as our own as audience, just watching these events, but also feels very immediate and present. And I wonder if you guys can each talk about how you got to that perspective. You know, watching Unrest, for example, it seems quite obvious to me that you would need to be in the film, but I understand you were initially quite resistant to that.
Oh, I wasn't resistant. It was more that I think From the beginning, I wanted to serve the story, and I couldn't know at the beginning if my presence in the film would best serve the story any more than I could know if I were filming another subject at the beginning, whether they were truly the right one, until I had gone down that process of shooting and trying to understand what is in broad terms, what is the journey of the film, what is the shape of the film. And so I wanted to be open to removing myself from the film, because I've seen films where by filmmakers who are in the film where I wish that they weren't in the film. So I kind of wanted to keep an open mind. And I think for me, one of the things, because I was living the experience from the inside, I had a very intimate and immediate view in my day-to-day life of what the emotional experience was of living with this. And especially because I was kind of following these other stories remotely, but even if I had been living with other people in the home, I think there are certain, like the presence of the camera always changes what is being observed and the dynamics between people, no matter how comfortable they become around you. And so I knew that the unique strength of my story in the film was that I could I could choose to film and reveal these very intimate moments that I don't think my subjects ever would have revealed, and kind of bring you even closer into the experience of living with us. So I think that, and then also the fact that in some ways it's a story of me learning how to live in a new body at the end of the day. I mean, it's many stories, but it's I think it's really about me coming to terms with being sick, with being disabled, and trying to figure out what my life means, and that in some ways entering into this as a kind of neophyte in this world, and where I'm interacting with people who have been sick for much longer than I have, and had lives beyond the beginning. It sort of worked in terms of the structure of the film, because I am essentially at the beginning of the film where the audience is as well. And I transform through the film in the way that I hope the audience does as they kind of follow me on the journey. So it's just sort of, I think both for the intimacy and because my presence and kind of infinite flexibility allowed the film to have a structure that would have been harder to find otherwise. I think those were the two reasons why I realized not only I needed to be in the film, but like what the unique strengths of me being in the film might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you really can, you're your own best subject. You can do whatever the director wants.
Yes, although it was funny. I sort of, so when when you see the film, a lot of people's reactions are like, oh, it was so brave that you did this, or that you included some of these scenes in the film. And it's a very different thing making a film with like a small team that you really trust and that you've gone on this journey with, and a very different thing exhibiting it in front of hundreds of people over and over again. I remember the first time I screened the film, I was sort of in the corner of the room, just like in a ball, like just totally pissed at this director who I trusted, who like had revealed all of these things about me. And it was the first time I saw myself as a subject, and which gave me empathy for what it's like, to kind of be that vulnerable in a film. But so yeah, there was definitely the subject and the director had different interests.
And Nanfu, you're in your film too, and. Yeah. Was that always your plan from the beginning?
No, actually, I am in both of my films, and neither was my plan. With Hooligan Sparrow is a film about human rights abuses in China, and I followed a bunch of activists, and it shows the consequences of a public protest. And I was in the film because eventually the national security agents interrogated me and threatened my family. But it was very difficult to put myself in. And definitely it was hard to shape myself as a character. Like, I didn't think myself as a character, as you said, that way. For a long time, I resisted of saying or showing too much of myself. Part of the reason was also being afraid of criticism, of putting yourself in the unnecessary. So when I was working on I Am Another You, I was really happy that finally this is a film that has nothing to do with me. I thought so. I was like, this is a film about this young traveler and his life, his family, his background, and his choices. So I edited the film that way until I did a rough cut screening of the film. And then I had a bunch of advisors and friends, and after watching the film, they all asked me, what's special about this guy? Why are we watching a film, like a 90 minutes film of him? We see people like him all the time on the street corner of New York. I have classmates, neighbors, everybody is like him. But what's unique about him? So he was totally not likable to a lot of people. And they started questioning me. It was like a therapy session. Lots of people was like, why are you so fascinated with him? Was it because he was handsome? Or was it because, like the questions were really, really ridiculous. And it was because of those questions that made me think, and by responding to them, I realized, okay, I found him interesting was because of my unique perspective, that I am from China and I had this desire of understanding freedom, and all the decisions that he made, to me, are symbols of freedom, and that's what attracted me. And realizing that and knowing that this aspect did not come up on the screen made me rethink of the film and how to tell the story. So it was from there I started pulling out all the footage of myself and inserting those in the film, and eventually changed the film into his story, but from my perspective. Yeah.
And Drew, did you have a plan to be in your film, or?
No, and not at all. I mean, I'm unlike Jen. I'm an outsider to the topic and was from the start. And it was really important for me, once I sort of got a handle on what the film was about, which was, to me, it's not really about illness, it's about relationships. And I wanted to make a film about people who are sick, not sick people, if that makes sense. And, but I always knew that because of the intimacy of filming, so like everything was, all the production was just me. There was no sound person. I didn't have any like wireless mics on people. It was all like very intimate, and I stayed with everybody that I filmed with, either camping on their land or, in some cases when it was possible, sleeping in sort of in their homes and wearing their spare clothes that would sort of wouldn't bother them when I was with them. So it was a really intimate environment and immersed for 2 or 3 weeks at a time at max. So my presence, I think, is felt just by the design of it. I mean, even the camera work. So I tried to minimize all the electronics and everything. So I use these really old lenses. There's no stabilizers, nothing to smooth anything out, and I had to use longer lenses to film with them. So I had to keep my distance with the camera to minimize how much it affected people. So I'm using longer zooms with them. So you feel me reacting to them through the camera, I think, more. Yeah, you're feeling my sort of reactions through my hands, through the lens and stuff. So, and also like you're getting a sense of, I mean, the access that I have is a result of really getting to know these people over years. I mean, I like all of them. You know, I'm rooting for them to get better, even though I think it's an objective sort of observational piece. I think the empathy is embedded just because, I don't know, I think every filmmaker, fiction or nonfiction, you're watching characters on the screen that the filmmaker can relate to on some level, even if they're like bad people or whatever. Like they can still, the filmmaker for a good film, I think, can relate to that person or that character on some level. And that's how I mean, that's why everybody in my film is there. I could relate to them in some way. And the conversations we had were mostly not about illness. I mean, we talked about baseball and music and you know, being a grandpa, and I don't know what it's like to be a grandpa, but we talk about their experience with that. And so, yeah, you know, I think my filmmaking DNA is on the film in a more implicit way through all those experiences.
And one of the sort of people that is in the film is a radio journalist who comes to interview one of your main characters, and there's this whole scene where has to change her clothes, and she wore her jacket to a bar last night, and it smells like cigarettes, and so she can't wear it in the house. She has to leave it in the car, and then her radio mics are sort of interfering with everything is just sort of like a little bit uncomfortable because there's this new person in the house, and that ends up sort of serving as a substitute for you in the film. And it made me also really think about, if it's not totally clear, the subjects and the sensitives have a kind of environmental sensitivity, and in some instances that leads to being affected by cell phone signals and radio waves and sort of the electronic noise that your cameras and microphones and sort of modern life emits, and the smells and chemical off-gassing and things like that. So I wonder, filmmaking is a technical endeavor, and it requires these sort of this modern technology. And did you worry that you were affecting their health in a way of making this film?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, it was a touch and go process. People's sensitivities to different things can vary quite a bit. So one of the main subjects, he was very electrically sensitive. So I'd have to cut with him fairly often. He would sort of, he would endure it because he believed in the film. He thought, this sort of story being told would make other folks like him feel less lonely. But he would ask me to cut pretty often. So, I am the elephant in the room in many ways for this film. Sort of like, well, how is he filming with them? And it was a topic of conversation in the edit a lot. And sort of like, do you include more of an acknowledgement of the camera? Do you include? There's a kind of whole other story about how they were filmed for this long. But the radio producer, the hope that she's included in it because the hope is that she serves as like an avatar for me, that you can kind of see what I had to, how I had to work with them and what I had to do to work with them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in Jennifer in Unrest, it's a similar parallel. You have the unique challenge of directing crews remotely, as you're sort of directing from your couch or your bed, and your subjects are being interviewed from their beds, and so they have new people in their homes and more severe or bright lighting scenarios, which can be difficult for them. And so, were you also worried about your subjects' health?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think we had a lot of conversations with. I had a lot of conversations with both our subjects and our crews that were actually very similar to sort of some of the challenges you were facing, because it's interesting because the patients watch it and they ask these questions, but the audience never would. But for some of the interviews, like how is someone that sick in a lit room like that? And it was really it was a number of the subjects are light sensitive, and so I think it was really always a conversation constantly about what their boundaries were, and having to trust that they would know when they needed to cut, but also that they were going to push themselves. And it was because this was a collaboration, because we all wanted this film to be made and we wanted to look good and to have a story told well. And so it was definitely a challenge, in part because it's not, I might have an instinctive understanding from my own experience of what the right questions are to ask, but everybody has different disabilities. I think one of the biggest challenges for me was on that subject was really getting our two DPs really comfortable with the idea of when things happen particularly in filming me, when I'm not going to be able to communicate, and there's a one scene in the film like this, what is your role? Like, if I am collapsing and I'm screaming in pain, what is your role in that moment? And there were, fortunately or unfortunately, when you have chronic illness, like the same things happen over and over again. So there were times when we didn't get that scene because I think, as a human, it feels inhumane to keep rolling, and you want to try to help. And so we had conversations that were, of the genre, like, my husband Omar, he's there, he will do what he can. There's really nothing you can do for me in these situations. But if you keep rolling, and in some ways, even if you come closer, like you're, and it's actually, I think, similar to your kind of POV in the film as the cinematographer. It's like the camera itself is an act of love and an act of compassion, and in those moments that are so painful, if they weren't witnessed, would just be meaningless. But if seen and witnessed, they have the potential to be transformed and acquire a new meaning in the sharing of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's such a gift from your subjects to the film to be able to sort of endure, to be a part of this film, to sort of shine, to sort of get some recognition or acknowledgement or empathy, and also the value of helping others, showing, this idea that we all sort of deserve to have an opportunity to see ourselves reflected in others, and to see it reflected in a very specific way like that. When you were, and so when you're asking people to be in your film, is that like, when do those ideas, are they a part of the conversation about why they would want to be in the film?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always paranoid about people doing it for egotistical reasons. There's a lot of power with a lens put on you, and so I was very sensitive to that. I wanted to know why someone would ever want to be filmed. I would never want to be filmed. I don't know why anybody does it. I understand why they do it there's huge sacrifice, right?
I feel the same way.
There's huge sacrifice with being filmed, like privacy and your life. I mean, it's even after years of filming with them, the film comes out and it's out there in the world and anyone can watch it. And it's a reminder for them, like, oh, right, like I've just sacrificed a lot of privacy in my life. So it was really important for me to know why they wanted to be part of the project.
Even as early as the casting process, it wasn't.
100%, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think there's another twist on it, and I wonder, for both of you actually, I wonder a lot of actually how ego played with your subject, but there is an aspect to, I don't know, it can become inauthentic and manipulative, I guess, if somebody's wanting to be filmed, and performative. Mm-hmm. If somebody wants to be, and I didn't want that. I wanted I just wanted people who'd forget that I was there so that I could show kind of their true selves to people rather than a performance. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you think?
It was so interesting because I asked myself this question a lot, and it's like why people accepted to be filmed. And I always ask myself, like, would I ever let anybody film me? And my answer is I would never, ever let anybody follow me and film my life or make a documentary. When I was a student at NYU, we did an exercise with classmates. So we interviewed each other. And I had a classmate who is also a friend of mine interview me for 30 minutes. And she asked a lot of intimate questions. And I, of course, like open-minded and then also answered honestly. And during like the middle of the interview, I broke down as she asked stories about my family and lots of very intimate things. And I cried and I shared the story. And that night I went back home and I couldn't sleep. I was like, oh my God, how she's gonna edit that part? Mm-hmm. Of course, I know, like whenever filmmakers saw, the subject crying on camera, that's like, wow, so emotional. Right. You wouldn't get rid of that footage, right? So I knew that she was going to edit that part, and it's going to be the highlight of the entire interview, and all my classmates and people will see it. And I couldn't sleep. I was like, it's a lengthy story, but it's going to be edited into 2 minutes, and I have no idea whether that would be taken out of context or not. And I regretted so much for sharing the story. Mm-hmm. And it was that night made me, I guess, more conscious about me filming others and interviewing others, because suddenly I understand the fear and the worry and the insecurity about being on camera. And for me, with both films, luckily it wasn't a lot of pre-production, like asking people whether I can film you or not. Both films were pretty spontaneous, especially with I Am Another You. I met him in a hostel, and we were sitting by the campfire. And we started talking, and by 2 a.m., lots of people already left, and it was just the two of us. And he shared a lot of stories with me, like many travelers would do with strangers. So at one point, I thought the story was fascinating and asked him, do you mind I get this on camera? And he said, no, go ahead. So I took out a camera and filmed another 2 hours of conversation. And to me, a good character should neither perform nor to be too shy. And I think we all can easily tell if somebody's performing for the camera or too nervous about being on camera. We can tell in 15 minutes or 20 minutes just by looking at them. And I think if I see signs of that, I would not pursue this as a main character or something. And him, from the very beginning, I noticed that he behaved the same on and off camera. And I think that was one of the reasons also that I decided to continue filming as well.
Yeah, but he also still has a good bit of bravado and swagger in his personality, and I think that's part of that's part of why he is a charismatic character. It seems that you do still want to have subjects that want to be filmed. If you're trying to convince them to be filmed, it often can lead to that kind of too shy or not forthcoming enough, just sort of, unsure of what they're really supposed to be doing, and makes it feel forced. Jennifer, one of the interviews that I thought was really very special in your film was with the woman who's I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of her job. She's the sort of genetic scientist that originally sort of found the genetic. Right, it's the genetic profile of
the immune profile, yeah.
The immune profile of chronic fatigue syndrome, and her interview. Normally in a science film or a health film, you have these talking head experts that really tell us this is the way it is. This is the mechanics of an illness, and she does serve that function. But there's also something so tender about her interview, and I don't know if do you think that she's just a very tender and compassionate subject, or is that something that is elicited from your interview style?
I think it's just her. She's hilarious and is also very expressive, and I think there are a lot of people who could have served. So part of the thing that was, I think, challenging about this film is to try to span a range of tones. So it's a personal film that has historical and scientific context, and is also about other people, and is it took a long time to try to figure out how do you make essentially at least three, if not more, genres of film feel like one film. And I think part of bending them a little bit closer to each other is by making choices like that, because it doesn't totally put you in that kind of talking head mode. I think it's sort of, there was someone who at a lab kind of talked about interview as behavior, and I think she's probably the only person that I interviewed who was an expert who I think really embodied that, because she feels things about the story she's telling about the science, and she feels the anger, and she feels the she feels the isn't this totally ridiculous? And she's so I think her feeling about what she's saying is as important as what she's saying itself, and that's just how she expresses herself. So I think if anything, it was sort of me choosing her, but I also just did really long interviews, in part because it's my own interest, and really wanting to kind of dive deep on what it is she had to say about being a scientist and a clinician and also a witness to everything that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Drew, in your film, there's sort of an emotional rant from the wife of one of your characters about the sort of difficulty of being partnered with somebody who's always sick, and who you're sort of giving your all to. And that's also, you don't have interviews in your film, but it's a quite revealing time of it. And did that come about naturally, or how did you elicit things like that?
Yeah, that scene where essentially she's lamenting the shift from being a spouse to a caregiver, and really sort of, and the loss of a husband, and transformed into someone that she takes care of. I knew I never wanted direct interviews in the film. I wanted as much as possible to witness it, but also my role in their lives became really unique. I happened upon people who were extremely isolated, very lonely, and I was the only person in their world that cared about what happened to them and cared about their stories, who wasn't sick, and cared about talking about things other than being sick. So I was a point of sort of catharsis for all of them that was really, really unique. Like the social contract between a filmmaker and a subject there's nothing like it. It's really strange and beautiful and uncomfortable sometimes. So I would just, I'd have the camera there, and she was upset. I noticed. I hadn't been there in I think a month, and I came back, and she just looked. She looked different. She looked like she'd been suffering for a month or so. So I it was right on the surface, and I was like, Lainey, are you okay? Like her husband had just been downstairs for something and went back up to he had a safe room built in his house, and it all just kind of came out. And at that point, we'd been filming for 2 years. I don't think that scene could have been filmed earlier. And she just kind of opened up to me, and what she is confessing to me is this guilt of feeling angry or frustrated, I should say, at her spouse for not being able to just ask her how her day was. And she can't talk to her kids about it. Like she articulates, I'm the only person she can talk to about it. But at least I don't know what it's like as a neutral audience member. The hope is that it doesn't feel like a direct address. It sort of feels like a monologue that she's sort of talking to. And in terms of technically, the camera's really far from my eyes, so even if she makes eye contact with me, the eye line is so far apart that I think it creates and it wasn't purposeful, I just like holding the camera lower because I'm really tall. But I think there creates a separation between the filmmaker and the subject that makes it feel like that the audience, as an audience, you kind of have a different seat from the filmmaker even. Like you're sitting still a little bit far apart, and you're a little bit more of an objective view than even what I was experiencing, if that makes sense.
That was interesting because he mentioned that scene wouldn't happen if it's 2 years early, because it's like 2 years of filming. And I agree with that. Like a lot of what, asking intimate questions was about timing. If I'm doing a character-driven film, I wouldn't interview the person the first shoot, for a lot of things. In I Am Another You, Dylan's father, the first time I met him, he revealed to me that he has tons of a video journal that he did over the years to deal with his own trauma and challenges in life. He would set up a camera and talk to the camera about the stresses. And that was the first meeting. And as a filmmaker, I heard that. I was like, oh my God, what if I can get all those tapes? Right. It would be great. But I couldn't ask him because he was like, I haven't shown this to anybody, not even my family. It's like my secret. One day when I die, I will give this to my sons, and they would know what kind of father they have. And after listening to that, I was like, oh, I don't know if I ever could get this or even take a look at this. But it was until a few months before the film was finished, I was editing and there was a rough cut, fine cut, and it's just missing. I feel like if I could get like this part with some of the intimate things, then I know the film would be complete.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that point I went back to ask, but I don't think I could ask if it was any earlier. And yeah, I think a lot of like the intimate things that they would share with you only when you have that relationship, like years or at least a long time.
Yeah, that timing and trust takes
I'm curious, because again, that social contract between filmmaker and subject, and it's very personal, and they're probably learning about you as well when you're working with them. When did you guys get releases from your subjects? I waited 2 years before I even brought it up.
It depends. If I know that I'm gonna keep filming for years, then I probably won't do it at very early stage. Like, I think it depends on the film. If, for example, I'm doing an hour film is not centered on any characters, and I know filming with this character probably is like Jen's film, like it's gonna be one-time filming the 2 times, and then I would get like the first that shoot because I probably won't go back anymore. With the films that I did character-driven, I usually do it like halfway through the filming, not too early, and we already had the trust, but also not too late, in case we don't know whether there are more shoots coming or not. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you?
Mostly at the beginning, except when you're at the end and you're like, oh wow, I never did that. Mostly at the beginning, and I think it was just, it's interesting. I didn't have the luxury of just kind of going in and exploring, right? Because my access to like the physical spaces of everyone else in the film was through the camera, and so I interviewed from bed over Skype using a kind of an iPad teleprompter, and also had a like live feed coming from the camera, the main camera, wherever we were shooting. And but I think for me, and this will never happen again, there was this immediate trust because I was always talking to someone who was in the same boat. There wasn't this distance that had to be traveled where, someone might think, well, do you really understand? Are you going to judge me? Are you going, do you get it? And is your perspective going to be one that stigmatizes and demeans me because that's my default expectation, because that's what the world does? And I'm sure there must have been a process for you to cross that. And I think, it's interesting. I had a lot of disadvantages in making this film, but we all do in our films, and we also have unique opportunities, and I think that drives a lot of the choices we make as well in terms of how to tell a story, and it's why every story needs to be told differently in a way. So, but the structure of the film was that the intimacy came from that bond that I think everyone in my community has with each other, and so I was really grateful for that. But I also, just kind of moving back to an earlier point, I did, there were some people that I just knew of that I approached to film, and I also did like an open casting call, and I talked, I read lots of stories, and I talked to many people, and we filmed with people who who didn't make it into the film, but it was always about, who, I only wanted to shoot with people who were game to go on this journey, in part because there were so many possible stories I could tell, so I wanted to make sure that I was working with people who really wanted to do it for the right reasons and were willing to open themselves up and go the distance, because I didn't want it to be a struggle to have to try to I didn't want them to edit for me. And yet I also knew that even though people were revealing so much of themselves, I wanted to honor what I thought was a true representation of them without being unnecessarily I think there's ways to exploit that trust that don't actually serve the film. And so it's always that balance of like, is this true, and will you feel like this was a true, is this true objectively, and will you subjectively feel like this was a true representation of yourself?
Right. Yeah. I have so many more questions, but I want you guys to have a chance to ask questions. You guys have some questions in the audience? way in the back, and I'll repeat your question.
Yeah, I have a question for Jennifer. I still don't quite understand how you technically did this. So you met these other people who have the illness online, and then you spoke with them via Skype, or because you're also mentioning a crew, so I don't quite understand how you...
Yeah, so I'll just to repeat the question. She's just asking about the sort of technical mechanics of how the shoots were conducted.
Yeah, so I mostly hired kind of, first found producers and hired local crews that would then work with kind of each of the subjects, or in the case of the U.S., we had one team in the U.S., and would conduct interviews over Skype, but there was so there's a device called it's like a Skype teleprompter, and it basically an iPad will sit in a kind of bed, and then there's a two-way mirror that reflects my image over the lens. So we would have these setups where my kind of face would be hovering over the lens, and people could kind of talk directly into the lens but to me. And I did hours and hours and hours of interviews like that. And so because in part the structure of the film is me trying to understand the illness, but really more that kind of the identity relationship side of it. It's sort of there are a lot of these sort of conversations that are me kind of asking the questions that I have in my own life of these other people. And then I also essentially had a remote monitor. So there's a device called a Teradek that compresses and can stream from any HDMI output. And so when the camera is rolling, so I was able to watch with a 30-second delay what the kind of main camera was shooting, and then I would text a lot. But it was this hard thing where you're like, I don't know how obtrusive to be because I'm not actually there. So it was a process of trusting the choices that my collaborators were making, and then also intervening when I thought it was really important, and then having lots of conversations before and then afterwards, and then going and doing it again. And so I think the biggest challenge was how do you, when you have such heterogeneous footage, in part because even though I did a lot of kind of sharing of screenshots and clips and things to try to also help people shooting in different stories to have a sense of the overall film. But fortunately, because it's just such a hodgepodge, it's sort of of quality between the self-filmed iPhone footage and then the 6300 footage. It sort of I think kind of fits and feels like a cohesive whole visually. It would have been harder, I think, if it were only one camera format and then you had these sort of obvious diversions from that. More questions? Yes.
You look incredibly healthy and happy, and I'm wondering if you can share your journey back to health, and also if you actually through that success, if you share that with any of your subjects.
Asking about journey to health. So it's I am a lot better than I was even a year ago, and I definitely keep getting better, and that's through treatment and I sort of some of the things I mentioned in the film, but sort of since then I've found other interventions. Namely a new drug that I love, that have really helped to make me more resilient. And so when if I overdo it and I crash, I tend to crash for, only a few days as opposed to, before, I remember this one time I went for a walk. I was in Seattle after a wedding, and this is when I used to walk, and I ended up in bed for 6 months. Because I miscalculated, and so that was the structure of the consequences of that, and now it's sort of much shorter in terms of what it is. I mean, I have this post on Medium that I've been meaning to finish writing because everyone's really curious about it, but I don't talk about it a lot because it's just misleading. It's like the entire internet is just sort of this kind of vast array of N of one stories, and it's those stories that help me get better because everything I'm doing I did hear about from someone else. At the same time, every single thing I'm doing has either helped somebody, harmed somebody, or had no effect. So that's true in any disease, right? Most drugs, if a drug works on 40% of the people with a diagnosis, that's a huge success. So it's sort of I'm conscious of the fact that because I'm so public, like I just don't want people to latch on to like anything that I'm doing as like the answer. But I do think that there are treatments out there that can help people substantially. The issue is that most people don't have access to them.
Filmmaking questions, yes.
Yeah, I was curious if each of the filmmakers could talk about the capacity for change that each of your perspectives or your filmmaking process have in catalyzing a new direction for your subjects, either in negative or positive or mysterious ways. Can you go about that conversation yourself and with your subject?
Talking about the sort of process of change within your subjects and how the film might affect change.
Well, with I Am Another You, it's still very soon to see the change. Dylan is the main character, and this is a spoiler in the film that he has some mental health problems, and he showed up at the premiere in March at South by Southwest, and before then I was hoping the kind of being in public, the experience would have some positive changes in his life. So we talked a lot, and he was very excited to go on to festivals, from festival to festival, and he started with the premiere. After the premiere, he told me that he didn't want to attend any screenings anymore. It was because facing so many people and getting questions, because he hears voices in his head, and being in that space amplified the voices to hundreds of times, and he felt he couldn't handle it. And so currently he's still traveling like he used to do, his old lifestyle. And the changes for his life is still not clear because of this film. And from my own experience, when I'm making film, of course, from the very beginning, I hoped for positive changes for the people in the film and for the community. With my first film, Hooligan Sparrow, I was hoping that the film could change the political situation in China and to release people who are in the film that were in the prison. And a year later, it didn't happen the way that I had expected. People in prison were still in prison. And I had gone through a process of being really hopeful and seeing the responses from the audience, like, okay, this is going to change a lot of things. And then a month later, nothing had changed, very disappointed. And then another month, seeing more people from the audiences saying, because that's the community that I directly interacted with. And they would be saying, young Chinese people who are outside of China would say, after seeing this film, I felt like my worldview has completely changed. I never look at the things the same again. Then there's another stage of me thinking, okay, maybe the changes are not that directly affecting people's lives, but it's in the concept, and then it's going to take a long time to come. But when it starts affecting people's thinking, I think eventually there will be positive changes down the line.
And you all?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really hard to measure. I think it's had a positive effect on everyone in the film. I mean, it's a mixed bag. Like, they did it for something, for a cause that's larger than just their own lives. So they're trying to tell their own stories to make other people feel less lonely. So yeah, one of the subjects, the woman who was described earlier, Lainey, whose husband is sick, she came to the premiere, and her whole family came as well, her children, and I think it was really great for her, and she got great questions from the audience, and people came up to her and let her know like how special she is. And Susie, she's the only one with the condition who came to a premiere we had in Santa Fe, which is close to her, so she could drive there. And I think that was huge for her, like huge to have, because she's so isolated, and she's basically a social worker for people with this condition. And so for people who aren't sick to come up to her and just say what you're doing is so valuable to the, like in general, was that validation meant a lot to her. And that was, I think, my greatest hope for everyone in the film, to feel just validation for their lives and their struggles being worthwhile, that there's a purpose beyond just sort of waking up the next day, which is something to easily take for granted, I think, if you're healthy or more functional than they are. But I think it's had positive changes. It's really hard. I mean, when you get super sensitive to like reviews that maybe like question their condition, like I don't know, there's a review every so often that you get that sort of, or even a comment somewhere like on Amazon or something, and someone says, oh, they're all like nuts and like they're all like a bunch of fakers. And that doesn't bother me, but what bothers me is that they could read that, and it's their lives. You know, they're not like characters in a Marvel film. They're real people, and so I'm really sensitive to that. So it's rough. It's tough. I don't know. I would never be filmed. It's really, really, really hard.
I have time for one more question. Yes.
I was wondering if there were any moments when you were filming, since these were such intimate relationships with people who were filming, that you came across sort of ethical questions of, should I actually film this? Should I actually include this?
Ethical questions of what to film and when to put the camera down?
I can start. It's not when to film and what to film. I did have like ethical questions, but mainly it was because I was living on the streets with him, and it became a question very soon as we started living on the streets, because I had money and I had a credit card. After a day, you know, like after a few meals, when I'm hungry, I could go to the restaurant and order food, but he didn't. So the question was, do I go and buy food for him? If I did so, then I changed his lifestyle. And then the film that I set up to do, which was filming his lifestyle, wouldn't be the same. And if I did, you know, it's just like the hierarchy. I have money and he didn't. And do I do the things the way that he did or not? So eventually I made a decision that I am only going to eat out of garbage as the same as he did too, and in order to be equal. And because otherwise, if I buy and don't give it to him, then I'm a filmmaker, his subject, and I didn't want to be that way. So it was a very interesting experience to eat out of garbage.
Yeah, there's one anecdote kind of sums it up. The most intense filming period for me was filming Susie travel from, she's sort of recovered, but it's her first time leaving her safe house for years to go to DC to attend a disability conference. And so I'm with her, you see moments of it in the trailer, with her on a plane and traveling through like the DC subway system. And that was really scary. I didn't know what was going to happen with her health-wise. So we had an agreement sort of, you know, she was like, well, you're going to like hold my hand while, I mean, literally she wanted me to support her while we're going through. And I was like, oh, it was such an awkward kind. I was like, Susie, I need to see how, because you're going to do this with or without me. I need to see how I need to witness this. Like that's a higher, you know, but there was no way I was going to let her like collapse to the ground and not, you know, drop the camera right there and then. So we had like kind of agreement that I was a safety for her, a safety net, like nothing terrible would happen to her, but I needed to see her struggle, as awful as that sounds. I was filming her in the DC subway, and she would ask people for directions. She got lost like constantly, and she'd ask people for directions, and almost always, like complete strangers, this happened 3 or 4 times, the person would like give them directions and then kind of look at her and say, you know, there's like a guy filming you from behind. And it comforted me so much that strangers would protect somebody who was so clearly vulnerable in public. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add?
I think for me the biggest, I think the biggest struggle I had was, so there was a story about a young woman named Karina who was taken from her home by police and forcibly institutionalized. And what's not clear in the film is this is actually something that has probably happened dozens upon dozens of times in many different countries. And, you know, my desire was, you know, as you're requesting the footage, was to like immediately try to do something to help, to intervene and change the story as I was shooting the story. And I both thought that was the ethical and humane thing to do. And at the same time, I faced this question of like, well, would it be effective? Because I know that once I started to do that, it would change the nature of the film. And I'd also, the film hadn't yet become something that actually would have had the power to have much of an impact. Because we weren't finished yet. And so I think kind of trying to help her family understand the bigger picture, which they did very generously and sort of immediately, was hard, and yeah, really dealing with that. I mean, I think witnessing something unfold that you feel is deeply unjust, and then, you know, waiting for the funding and the edit, you know, I think that was really hard for me to be able to sit with. But we had our European premiere. This one won't make sense, anyone hasn't seen the film, but we had our European premiere in Copenhagen and had a lot of press, and I think that was the moment when I felt, okay, like it was good to be patient. But I think that's really hard whenever you want to intervene, because you might be able to help in some way, but you know that you shouldn't.
Yeah, it's a tough line. Well, thank you all so much for your beautiful films, Nanfu, Drew, and Jen.
Thank you.